You cannot leave your religion. It's a one-way ticket, you know. You cannot leave Islam without being punished for it. Clearly states, you know, that apostasy is punishable by death. In my less charitable moments, I find that so-called moderate Muslims are really rather dishonest intellectually. They pretend that the real Islam is tolerant, that the real Islam is pro-women, the real Islam is for freedom of expression. It's nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. Islamic slavery was far worse than anything that happened in the West. The Atlantic slave trade, Arabs shipped 17 million black Africans to the Middle East, to the Ottoman Empire, to Arabia. I've been quiet when I should have spoken up.
What held you back? Do you think Islam can be reformed? Hello and welcome to the Winston Marshall Show with me, Winston Marshall. I had the privilege of sitting down with historian, scholar and author Ibn Warraq. Ibn has been writing about Islam and Muhammad for a long time. We took a deep dive into the history of Islam, the history of Muhammad, the evidence in the scripture, what the truth might be. We looked at previous guests, what they've said on this show. As you've been following, you will have similar questions to me. We also went into Ibn's life, his personal journey, his what I think is a very courageous journey, speaking up when few others feel they can. All of that and much more. Before listening, I ask, if you want to support the show, all you have to do is press subscribe. You press the subscribe button, I can have more wonderful, incredible guests like Ibn Warraq discussing the issues you want to hear about. But without further ado, Ibn Warraq. Maybe you can tell me and listeners and viewers who don't know your story. I think it's quite amazing that you've from India originally. You became one of the preeminent scholars and writers, authors of several books, including Why I'm Not a Muslim, and you live under a pen name, a nom de plume, to disguise your identity, as I've understood it, for reasons I'd like to hear about. But maybe you can tell your story from India to where you are now.
Yes, I was born in a city called Rajkot, which is still a part of India. In fact, Gandhi grew up there, although he was not born there. He was Gujarati. He was born on the coast in Porbandar. Anyway, my father was a nominal Muslim. His father persuaded him to leave India and go to the newly created state of Pakistan in 1947. So when I was just one and a half, we moved, my family and I, we moved to Karachi, Pakistan. And from there, my father thought there was no real future in this theocratic state like Pakistan, and decided to send it to England. That's to say, me and my brother, who was a year and a half older than I was. And I went to prep school and then to public school in the British sense in England. And then I went on to Edinburgh University, where I studied Arabic and Persian, amongst other things. And then I became involved with some secular humanists. I realized I was really an atheist and certainly a humanist. And I got in touch with an organization called the Center for Inquiry, founded by a philosopher, American philosopher called Paul Kurtz. I started writing for them, for their magazine called Free Inquiry. And I wrote an article for them, a short article called Why I'm Not Muslim, because they had been looking for somebody to write something on Islam. They had been writing, they had a series of speakers, writers who wrote Why I'm Not and then a Mormon, why I'm not a Jew, why I'm not a Methodist, and so on.
Bertrand Russell's famous
Based,
article, Why I'm Not a Christian.
Calc on his work. They couldn't find anybody to do something on Islam, so I volunteered to do it. And my article turned into a book. So,
why do you think they couldn't find anyone to do it on Islam?
Well, they just were not in touch with many ex-Muslims. They just did not know of any. It was much easier to, obviously in America at the time, it was in the 1990s, to find somebody, from the Christian religion and always offshoots.
Is that because there aren't many Muslim apostates, or is that because...
Well, at the time, this was, I think, around about 1989, I first wrote the article. They just didn't know that many people, many ex-Muslims, in fact. They were not used to having arguments or dialogues with Muslims generally at the time. And when they saw my name in some other journal, I forget what, they chopped at the idea of recruiting me to do this article on why I'm not a Muslim.
Your turn from, was it more against Islam or is it more towards atheism? Because your writing is very critical of Islam. At that point in your life, what was your spiritual journey? How did you become...
Well, I realized that I was really a skeptic, and my favorite reading by then, I was 18, 19 by then. I think I was married by now. Yeah, I was married, and my favorite authors are people like Gibbon and John Stuart Mill, various secular humanists in America, like Paul Kurtz himself. And I realized that I myself was a skeptic, really, and I was keen to do something for the Islamic side of things. And I had studied, I was not particularly a brilliant student, but I had studied Arabic and so on at Edinburgh University. So I was happy to go back to those educational roots.
Was your interest in Arabic because of your interest in Islam at that point?
When I decided to go to Edinburgh, I wanted to really study European art history. But I had a kind of crisis of identity, and I thought perhaps I'll try and find out a little bit more about Islam and my Islamic identity. That's why I chose Arabic and Islamic studies at Edinburgh, which just happened to. I mean, it's a sheer coincidence, really, in a way. It had a very famous, reputable scholar of Islam, a man called Professor Montgomery Watt, who'd written a 3-volume biography of Muhammad, the Prophet, which was very positive. I think one of the earliest really positive biographies of Muhammad. This was must have been written in the late 60s, I think. I can't remember the exact dates now. But that was one of the reasons I chose Islam, to get at my roots, my intellectual roots.
Having a crisis of identity at that age is interesting. This is one of the phenomena I think we're seeing in Britain, particularly of second-generation immigrants to Britain, where they don't necessarily feel at home in English culture, so they turn towards their Muslim heritage and to the mosques, and that seems to be one of the crux points of the problems of integration at the moment in Britain. I wonder if you have insight into that. Why do you think you had an identity crisis?
One of the reasons is I wasn't sure that I would really ever be really accepted as an Englishman. I mean, I really in my head, in my upbringing and so on, up from the age of 10 onwards, I had become an Englishman. I wrote about that in one of my books. When I was, above all, when I was coming back into England from a trip abroad in France, for example, I remember arriving at Dover with I think I still had a Pakistani passport at the time, and being asked, where I was from and so on. And then people later on would say, "Where are you really from?" And I got rather upset at times. And then
Do you think that was on account of your race? Or
because of my looks,
Pakistani?
I didn't look. Yeah, exactly. It was based on looks essentially. In fact, I remember once when I was studying philosophy afterward at Birkbeck College, I mentioned the fact that I thought Bertrand Russell had a wonderful literary style. And my friend saying to me, "Well, yeah, of course you would notice that, because an Englishman wouldn't notice that. You're being foreigner would notice that."
What a peculiar comment.
It was very odd, and I felt very upset about that as well. So, I mean, if you don't speak well, you're not English. If you speak well, you're speaking too well. Yeah. No Englishman speaks so correctly, and so on.
Yeah. So there's a sort of irony then, is that you lent in towards your Muslim heritage because of an identity crisis, not feeling included, or not feeling like English people were necessarily including you as English, and then you come out the other end an atheist. So rejecting
I realized that that I really wasn't a Muslim. That it didn't help me at all going back to my Islamic roots.
So then there must have been a second identity crisis.
Yes, I was happy to acknowledge the fact that I was not a Muslim, and I was happy to write about my acquired Englishness. I was heavily into Englishness of English art, a la Pevsner, and I identified. I used to go to holidays in Norfolk, so the Norwich School of Painters and Artists and so on. I liked the Englishness of painters like Samuel Palmer and Mary Russell. It's the woman who wrote Our Village. Anyway,
so it resonated with you.
Yes. I felt Hausmann's poetry. It was very much. I went to
Huysmans is French, though, isn't he?
Hausmann, no. Hausmann, no.
Oh, sorry. I'm thinking.
I meant he wrote about Ludlow and Shropshire, the Shropshire lad. But in fact, he grew up in Worcestershire. That's where my prep school was. So I identified with him and his poetry. And there was also regional writers at that time. A man called who wrote under the pen name B.B. just with inverted commas around the two B's. And so many other things which resonated more with me than anything that. In fact, I no longer spoke any Urdu, which is the language I was born into, and a dialect which we spoke at home. We spoke Kutchi, which is related to Sindhi. We used to speak Kutchi with my grandmother. My mother was already dead when I was 1, and we spoke Urdu to my father. It was strange, but and the national language at the time in Pakistan was Urdu. So I'd forgotten by the time, after 3 years, I was really losing most of my, original languages.
What did your family make of you rejecting Islam?
No, they don't know. They still don't know. My father died while I was at Edinburgh in 68, 1968. And my mother, I never knew. My brother doesn't know I've written all these books.
How could he not?
Well, because of the pen name. That's one of the reasons why I have a pen name, is to protect them. He wouldn't. My brother is a gentle soul. He would not dream of harming me. But I was afraid that relatives might take it out on him. My atheism and my apostasy might blow back on him. And I'm glad that I chose a pen name in the end. In fact, one Financial Times, I think it was, journalist suggested I reveal my real name, and then I was okay, I'll do it. And then he said, "Are you sure you really want to do it?" And I thought again about it, and I realized no, it would be just too much. And also, I was married by then. I had 2 children, and I thought it would put their lives in danger.
Why is it that you would put their lives in danger? Why is it that you felt that your brother might be under threat? Is this something that's unique to your family? Is this something that's unique to Islam? There's certainly, I've had Ayan Hirsi Ali, our mutual friend, on the show, famously has a fatwa, Salman Rushdie fatwa. Is it an Islam problem?
It is.
Or is it a more
No, it is
family issue?
very much an Islam problem, and also a social, I don't know whether it's Islamic social circumstances or there tends to be very little private life in Islamic countries, especially Pakistan. People feel that they have the right to question you about the way you're bringing up your children and so on. In fact, amazingly enough, when I was going through Pakistan, almost exactly to the day, 30 years after I'd left, I was working for a French travel agency called Fram Voyage, and I was taking French tourists to Bangkok, and we had to pass through Karachi. And I took some time off to go and see one of my father's friends. And the first question, he hadn't seen me for 30 years, the very literally first question was, "Your children Muslim?" He said, "Are you bringing them up as Muslims?" And I already felt threatened. I hadn't written anything by then. This was about 1986. I left Pakistan at 1956, so exactly 30.
And that was a threat, not just a open question. It was like,
No, it felt very much like a threat to me. And then, of course, 3 years later, in 89, you had the famous Rushdie fatwa. There is very little respect for private space in Islam and in Islamic countries, anyway.
Is that a cultural issue, or is that a theological? How much is that tied to the religion itself? Or you could go from country to country, and it's very different norms in different Muslim countries.
It's very much a theological question. You cannot leave your religion. It's a one-way ticket. You cannot leave Islam without being punished for it.
Where are the roots of that? Is that from the Quran? Is that from
it is
Hadith?
Interpretations of various verses in the Quran. I think I mention it in one of my books. It's in the Hadith as well that apostates must be killed. They must be given a chance to recant, and then after the fourth occasion, then must be put to death. It is definitely there in the Quran. And the theologians like Maududi, who's a Indian who became the spokesman for Pakistan, he was born obviously before partition, and he clearly states, that apostasy is punishable by death. Yeah.
Do you think, I mean, we might be going now into a little bit into theology and love to come back to your story, but is this a fundamentalist Islam issue? Do you separate between Islam and fundamentalist Islam? There are peaceful sects of Islam. Is it pronounced
Ismailis, yeah.
Yeah, for example, high achieving group. If you look at, I look at the Emiratis today as leading the way for a peaceful Islam on a geopolitical on that scale, and there seems to be that is it drastic to paint tar the whole 1 point however many billion Muslims with the same brush, or is there separation there? Is there different sides to Islam?
Well, it's a question which is difficult to answer because I don't know. There are various so-called moderate Muslims who will be present on Wednesday when I speak, like Dr. Zudi Jassa, who says he's a moderate Muslim. He doesn't believe in jihad and all the, but
You're speaking, sorry, at Ayan Hirsi Ali's foundation in Washington, D.C.
That's right, on the 15th.
On the topic of?
On defending the West from all her detractors, her enemies, internal and external.
Well, we'll come back to that. But sorry, you were saying about the different Islams and moderate Muslims.
Yes. Now, I find that a very useful distinction, which I found in Bernard Lewis, who in fact became a friend. But he makes very little use of it, oddly enough. He just threw it out in one of his prefaces, which is between Islam 1, Islam 2, and Islam 3. Islam 1 is what's in the Quran and what the theologians developed. Okay, Islam 2 is what's in the Hadith and what the theologians constructed. And Islam 3 is Islamic civilization, what Muslims actually do rather than what they should do. So, for example, until recently, oddly enough, very ironical in a sense, homosexuality was much more tolerated in Islamic countries. And I quote, I forget which one of my books, my first one, I think, Why I'm Not a Muslim, the story told by an anthropologist, a British anthropologist, about how young boys were married off to grown men, and the whole ceremony was very much celebrated in public in a village in Egypt. It was quite open. And then there are stories.
What period is this? What year is it?
1930s. He was writing in the 1930s.
As recently as the 1930s, that was happening.
Yeah. And there's I quote one story in my book. Compton Mackenzie, who's not much read these days, wrote a story about homosexuality. It must have been one of the earliest novels in English, written in the 1950s. About an English homosexual who went to North Africa, where he found that people were much more tolerant of his lifestyle.
So what changed then? What happened?
Well, this a new, more fundamentalist strain came into existence, especially with the rise of Khomeini.
So that's from 79, though.
70s.
So you think 1979 is the kind, or the 70s?
I think so, yeah.
It's the change point.
But 79, if you like, yeah.
So not just in the Shia Islamic world, across the entire.
He influenced. His influence went across all these.
How would that be? Because I thought that there was quite a big contention between the Shia and the Sunni. How did his reach go across the Sunni world?
It did because they found whatever they needed in his fundamentalist interpretation. Sayyid Qutb was a Sunni, but he drew inspiration from Maududi, for example.
Qutb was writing in the 20s. Is that right?
No, he was right. He wrote in the 60s, early
Oh, okay.
60s. I
Okay.
think he was executed in 66. I forget now. But he's certainly drew inspiration from whatever, across various boundaries. There's a lot of American analysts got this idea in their head that Sunnis and the Shias they never cooperate. That we're okay. We don't need to worry about Khomeini getting together with some regimes in the rest of the Islamic world, and they were proved wrong. And then now I'm not sure what the situation is. I know various intellectuals in the Islamic world were very much impressed with Khomeini and his uncompromising stance on these issues.
So they were impressed by his going back to more fundamental, literal interpretation of Muhammad's and his teachings in the Quran.
Right, right. Now, to answer your question, you do get some Islam 3, you get Muslims who are moderate, but Islam itself is not moderate. If you like, Islam 1 and 2 are not moderate. Islam 3, people who within Islamic civilization, some of them are moderate, some of them are not fundamentalists. But if you stick to the strict theology, then it is fundamentalist. What percentage and so on, I don't know.
Well, I can throw a quick percentage out, which I found very eye-opening, to say the least. This is from about a month ago. The Henry Jackson Society published statistics about British Muslims, and there's about 4 million British Muslims. 76% don't believe there was rape and murder on October 7th in Israel, and a large percent support Hamas. So I'm quite curious, and I've asked previous guests about the moderate Muslims and who represents them. Where are those voices? I had Ed Hussein on the show, and I think he is one of the great moderate Islam voices or moderate Muslim voices. But I'm trying to get a context of how far spread or how widespread his version of Islam is. I wondered if you had insight into that.
No, I find that in my less charitable moments, I find that so-called moderate Muslims are really rather dishonest intellectually. They pretend that the real Islam is tolerant, that the real Islam is pro-women, that the real Islam is for freedom of expression. It's just it's nonsense. It's absolute nonsense.
Based on the scripture.
Yes, exactly. If you base it on Islam's 1 and 2, it clearly isn't. So, I mean, in a sense, who's been more? I suppose I could be accused of essentialism, saying what Islam is and Islam isn't. It's not up to me to decide. I'm not a Muslim anymore. Incidentally, I don't trust Ed Hussein at all.
Why not?
I think he indulges in double speak. But anyway, that's another matter.
Do you don't think it's an honest attempt to try and square Islam with modern temperaments and
No, I don't. I really don't. I think he was working with Douglas Murray in Social Cohesion Society or
Centre for Social Cohesion
Institute or whatever.
Yeah.
Was he working with them? I think so.
I'm not sure, but I know that Douglas is involved in that.
Their very presence in that institute inhibited many of the people there because of their Muslim presence. Even now, I'm going to be speaking on the 15th in Washington, and I know there will be Zudi Jasser in the audience and a couple of other.
Who's Zudi Jasser?
He's an American of Syrian origin. He's a doctor. He's standing for.
Oh, I've heard him speak, but sorry, go on. For listeners who don't know, yeah.
He's going to be present. And his very presence has made me inhibited, has made me embarrassed because I say I'm talking about, for example, slavery. And the fact that Islamic slavery was far worse than anything that happened in the West. The Atlantic slave trade, the Islamic slavery, they shipped 17 million, the top figure. Arabs shipped 17 million black Africans to the Middle East, to the Ottoman Empire, to Arabia, and further afield.
Over what period? That was
centuries earlier than anything that started by the Europeans. Starting from before the 7th century when Islam set in. And there was a higher death rate because it involved the castration of young black males. And there was no anesthetic. And thousands died, millions died on the way. So it was gruesome, and abolition movement did not take root in the Islamic world. In the Ottoman Empire, there was firm resistance to it. Whereas it's very much a Western concept, abolition. It was very much a Western Christian initiative. People like William Wilberforce and Henry Thornton and so on, the Quakers especially, but it did not resonate with the Islamic world.
We'll come back to your point about why you feel inhibited from speaking today, but I kind of want to explore this history because I think some listeners and viewers might not really have a very good understanding of Islamic history necessary. And we can go all the way to Muhammad, and maybe we'll come to that later. But seeing as we're on slavery, it seems to me that post-Muhammad, up until the slave trade and beyond, it's a very bloody history. And if you look at the Islamic wars moving from the Arabian Peninsula and or the Islamic, I guess, colonialist imperial project all the way to India, where 110 million Mughals, am I got that right, were killed, i.e. the biggest genocide in human history. 110 million Sikhs were killed under the Mughal Empire. Can you paint a bit of a picture that for people who don't necessarily know the Islam history?
The traditional dates to start the Islamic Empire began really at the death of the Prophet Muhammad. It was 632 AD after Christ. And it spread very, very quickly to North Africa, then the Byzantine Empire, which was slowly taken over. And then they got as far as Poitiers in France, and they conquered most of Spain and so on. By the time that they overran, there were the Berber dynasties in North Africa, and then they arrived at the gates of India also in the 8th century with Mahmud of Ghazni and so on. And then later on, the Mughals didn't arrive until late 15th century. But soon, they were overrunning most of what used to be the classical world, Rome and Greece, and so on.
I made a mistake earlier. It was actually the Hindus as well as the Sikhs. I didn't, in India. But forgive me. So it was the genocide of the Hindus
Yeah.
in India. I made a mistake earlier saying it was the Sikhs, but there's a bloody history that doesn't seem that we have either completely forgotten or never really knew about in the West. There's an amnesia or something that's going on that we in denial of it. I wonder even if Muslims today are aware of the bloody conquest of Islam.
The most tolerant Mughal emperor was Emperor Akbar. He actually turned against Islam. He was an apostate emperor. He encouraged Hinduism. He had lots of Hindu wives and so on. He renounced Islam, but he was followed immediately by his grandson. It must have been, I guess. Aurangzeb, I forget the dates now. 17th century, was the most intolerant of all the Mughals. This is following Akbar, who was the most tolerant, to Aurangzeb, who he destroyed. I have lots of statistics for the number of temples, Hindu temples destroyed. This was known as the Furor Islamicus to Indian art historians. Destruction committed by the intolerant Muslims who didn't want anything to do with the idolatry, as they termed it, of the Hindus. So they went around trying to eradicate Hinduism from the subcontinent.
What about then slavery? Coming back to slavery, is there a sense that Islam has dealt with that? You know, in the West, the last few years, the issue of slavery has been brought up, and the part played by the West and the slavery in America, trying to atone for those sins, has become a very important part of the discourse. Is there any such discourse in the Islamic world?
Not at all. Not at all. Not an ounce of self-doubt or self-questioning. There's no self-criticism in Islam. It's considered a taboo subject. The United States, the total number of slaves who came, 12 million were shipped across the Atlantic. Do you know how many came to the United States?
It's like 200,000, 300,000, right?
388,000, exactly.
Well, the problem with that statistic is that by comparison, it's interesting because
Right.
we would many people would guess a lot more. But don't forget that there were many millions who were slaved, who were the offspring, progeny of those imported.
Yes.
So it's not quite that simple. Well, maybe that's not the point you were going to make.
If you're talking about reparations, for example, only about how many white people owned slaves? Something like just under 2% of the whites actually owned black slaves. 98% of the whites are asked to pay reparations, and it's another issue, moral dimension to this. But the thing is, Islamic countries have never, ever been asked to pay reparations. And yet the United States, it had only 388,000 shipped over originally. Far more was sent across the Arabian desert. And then the West has poured in more than $400 billion into Africa since, out of a sense of guilt. $400 billion. What happened to them? Still, Africa, south of Sahara, contains some of the poorest countries. Level of education, level of healthcare, and so on. So, I mean, that's not the answer to their problems. Now, more and more African leaders are recognizing that you can't blame everything on slavery in the way that African Americans attribute all their present failures to slavery. Lack of education, lack of I don't know, the breakup of the marriages and so on. One-parent families, the greater number in African American, but it cannot possibly be attributed to slavery. But in fact, blacks generally before in the 19th century there were more black marriages than white ones. In fact,
Thomas Scholl shows that it's bizarrely to what one might think, it's from the civil rights movement later that the fact that black African American families, there's the breakdown in families, but before then there's actually quite high marriage rates.
right?
So, okay, back to the issue of slavery in Islam. Is there no sense of guilt, as you described, because of something to do with the theology? Is
Yes, because
slavery permitted in Islam?
Yes, slavery was recognized by the Quran, definitely. Maybe it's encouraged, the manumission or the liberation of slaves is encouraged, but certainly it is there. It's accepted. It was accepted. Right up to the 1950s, there were black slaves being even now, in the 21st century, in the Sudan, you can find slave markets.
ISIS treated the Yazidis, take them in as slaves.
Indeed.
So that's in the scripture, you think?
It certainly, it was accepted social practice, I guess. I don't know how much it depends on the theology. I don't know. I really can't remember.
If you are a Muslim, how do you deal with the scripture like that, or scripture about how they treat women, how they treat apostates, how you've previously examined? How can one tackle that difficulty?
Well, exactly. That's what I was saying earlier. Is you can't do it with any real honesty because you if you think that the Quran is the actual literal word of God, then you would have to, somewhere along the line, you have to say this is no longer applicable. Yeah, I know it's the word of God, but that was meant for 8th century, 7th century Arabia. It's no longer applicable to us. It was designed to deal with the situation back then. Is that option available to modern Muslims? People like Khomeini would say no. It's a eternal word of God. It's applicable for always. It is your duty to promulgate these laws in the present.
And it says through the Quran, one must take this literally. It says that throughout the Quran.
Yeah.
So actually, you would argue that Khamenei now, they are intellectually honest.
At least, yes. They've
They
been
are consistent with the
least.
scripture.
Exactly.
Before going back to your previous point, I just want to ask about the historic Muhammad. So this seems quite fundamental to me. Who was Muhammad? This is something you've written about, The Quest for Historical Muhammad, a famous book that you edited. This is an issue that came up actually in my conversation with Ed Hussein. Now, I'll start with the tricky issue of Muhammad's wives. I brought up the fact that Muhammad is alleged to have had a 6-year-old wife and consummated when she was 9, which is obviously a very difficult or inconvenient issue, inconvenient thing. But he said I was wrong. He said that firstly, that was contested. Secondly, the evidence of that was written 90 years later. And there is other evidence that specific wife was actually older. I'm quite interested by that. And seeing as you've studied it, do you think Ed is right in saying that, or is there more to the story about?
No, that just shows you the kind of dishonesty you get involved in.
What's the truth about that young wife?
One thing is true, that all our knowledge of the lives of Muhammad, the Prophet of Islam, are based on literary evidence, which some of it dates more than 300 years after his supposed death. So there are no surviving extant, documents which are contemporaneous with Muhammad,
including the Quran.
including the Quran. We don't know what the origin of the Quran. In my view, the Quran has very little to do with somebody called Muhammad. But that's another issue.
We'll come back to that.
Come back. So our knowledge, Hussein is right in one sense, that our knowledge of all the his wives, what he did, and so on, are contained in the Hadith. The Hadiths were written over 300 years after his death. So how can but see, somebody like Hussein will argue about the details of his life, but when it becomes inconvenient, he will bring up the idea of lateness of the sources. But if they're late, they're late for everything. I mean, not a single aspect of his life is authentic. It's all made up centuries later, and it's true that in order to sanctify, to justify a current practice, many people invented hadith and then retrojected it to this mythical past to justify present practices. So if you had somebody who was into young girls, he comes up with this story that Muhammad was married to a 9-year-old or 8-year-old, consummated when she was 9. Well, I forget the detail. And this is true for all these things, like stoning to death for adultery and so on and so on. So either you throw out everything that we know, supposedly that we know about Muhammad, you pick and choose. But then, I mean, why is one story better than the other? And then you come up with this nonsense about the wonderful memories. You have to invent how the Arabs had this fantastic memory and they could remember things over 200 years. And they passed down this tradition. You had this long list of chain of authorities. In fact, if you look at all the hadith, they're incredibly childish. You have the story of a bunch of men, soldiers, sitting around a campfire. And he says, I remember the Prophet saying to me once that one mustn't use a toothpick after eating something.
The first time I sat down to read the Hadith, I think maybe the third passage was about farting. It's about when it was appropriate to fart and not fart.
Right.
So, yeah.
How anybody can take any of this nonsense seriously, and that Western scholars, historians, have accepted it for all these years. It's just unbelievable. It's unbelievable how they've been uncritical in their look at the sources for our knowledge of early Islam. So that's why I think we don't know where this book called the Quran actually comes from. We really don't. The stories of it's been passed down through oral tradition, and that it is just nonsense, a complete nonsense.
So where the moderate Muslims, though, might be right is that you don't necessarily have to take it literally because we don't know what's true and what's literal.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so actually is there not room for hope there that given that we don't know, then you could say there's legitimate reasons that you can edit out or change things?
Yeah, I agree.
Because you could
but
challenge
you would
the
have to
legitimacy
then
of the sources.
say that our knowledge of the Quran, where it came from, is pretty shaky.
What do we know anything at all that we can say? Do you agree that there was a man called Muhammad in the Arabian desert?
No, I'm not certain that there was somebody called Muhammad. No, it is very, very much rather a coincidence. This name, which means the praised one, that he should have had this name. It's just not it's just not credible. I think what happened is a bit like Robin Hood. Okay, this traditional story of Robin Hood, as seen in the movies of Errol Flynn or somebody, uh, Little John, Friar Tuck, of the minstrel, forgot his name. Um, these are obviously literary creations. There may have been some rebel, or was it 12th century, 11th century, I forget. Robin Hood is 11th, it's time of the Crusades, 10th, 11th century. There may have been somebody in 11th century who occasionally attacked rich merchants or somebody. But the rest of the story that we know, which has been passed down to us, is literary creation.
A better analogy might be King Arthur, because
Yeah, that's another one.
King Arthur, we don't know that there's no evidence that it existed, but it's possible that there was someone fighting the Anglo-Saxons coming over some sort of Britain, and he is the foundational myth in some ways of England's national myth.
Right. Yeah, yeah.
Okay, so Muhammad, you don't accept that there's necessarily a real Muhammad, but what happened immediately after Muhammad suggests that there was some sort of inspiration, because straight away you have this conquest from that region that spreads out across the world, as you described earlier. So something happened that inspired that.
I wouldn't know how to characterize that. Did they consciously create a myth? I don't know. I really don't know.
As well as speaking to Ed Hussein, I spoke to Ayan Hirsi Ali, our mutual friend, and her take on it is that there was Muhammad at the time of Mecca, a peaceful man trying to spread some good messages, and this ties in with Ed's version, is that after a period of time his message wasn't getting anywhere, so you get the Medina version of Muhammad, who is a fighter, a warmonger, and with the Medina version of Muhammad, we have associated all the parts of the Quran which are far more anti-Semitic, far more brutal. Do you accept any of that narrative?
No, not
What's wrong with that narrative?
None of it makes any sense.
Tell me why Ayan and Ed are both wrong there.
This is based on the traditional picture. The notion of Mecca and Medina is already a literary construct made by the apologists of Islam. There's no evidence that Islam started in Mecca. Absolutely none whatsoever. It's all based on literary sources 200 years afterwards, including the Mecca and Medina business. Really, now, even on their own account, it doesn't make sense, because even if you accept this traditional picture of Mecca and Medina, it's in fact so early and later, early Mecca, later Medina. In fact, the so-called verses of the sword, some of them, in fact, are early. They're not later.
How do you know they're earlier?
Well, exactly. This is another. Exactly. How would you decide? Okay. The whole thing is nonsense. That's why I've been working. I'm one of the founding members, really, of a group of basically French, German, Belgian scholars who created a group called the Inara group. Inara means enlightenment in Arabic. And they have been the only group which has been critical of the sources, critical of the traditional picture. And they've been chipping away at the traditional picture since 2007, I think. So nearly 25 years. And one of the things they established If the language of Arabic I'll get this argument right. If it had been born in Mecca, it would have been more natural for them to write that language using South Arabian writing system, because the South Arabian writing system allowed for sounds which you difficult to transliterate in the Arabic that we know. There's a scholar called John Wansborough, an American who lived and worked in fact, he lived not far from where I ended up in southwest France. John Wansborough, he said that people started fabricating so-called pre-Islamic poetry. But this was all invented to give the Arabic language a venerable antiquity. They would invent it in the 8th century and then reject it on its past. But there's no way that this poetry reflects anything to do with pre-Islamic Arabia, because our knowledge of pre-Islamic Arabia, again, is based on very late sources. There's no way of getting around the lack of sources, written sources.
So yeah, the message I'm getting is that there's no real evidence for it. Another thing that's curious about the Quran is that there's a lot of pieces of Jewish and Christian history, or rather more specifically, stories from the scripture of Jewish and Christian scripture. And this is actually something that the historian Tom Holland wrote about, in that it's almost like, I think it's, he wrote a history doing the historical, what we know historically about the Jews, the Christians, and Islam, the foundations of those religions. And he said, if you read the Quran, and I sort of agree with this, it's almost like someone's misremembered aspects of Jewish and Christian scripture.
He got all that from me, by the way.
Oh, he plagiarized you?
Yeah. he was, that's another one. I won't go into that.
No, go on.
But he picked my brains. We spent hours together, and I sent him...
You and Tom Holland, yeah.
In London. And I sent him so many articles, he'd never heard of, books he had never heard of. Since he doesn't know German, I had to find translators for the German scholarship on him. And then he wrote, based a lot on my sources there, my early anthology there. And then I asked him, why did you not thank me? He said, I forgot.
Tom Holland, if you're listening, I think you owe Mr. Warrack a thank you.
He said he would correct that in future editions, but I don't think he ever did. I never looked at any later editions. I couldn't be bothered.
Did you read his book?
No, I haven't actually read it. In the Shadow of the Sword.
That's correct. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So that's where he comes from. You really. This is the book you need to go to if you want to. Can we go back to your point earlier? So you're here in DC now, and you have said you're speaking at a conference in. Sorry, we're not in DC. We're in New York, but you're going to DC. You're speaking at a conference of Iron, and there are other Muslims present, and their presence makes you feel inhibited to speak truthfully. Why are you inhibited by their presence?
Bad manners. I feel a bit embarrassed, but...
Or the opposite, good manners. You're too mannered to speak how you feel or what you think.
Yeah, I'm too... I suppose I don't want to hurt anybody's sensibilities. I mean, I'm not going to censor myself. I'm going to speak exactly what I wrote down, in fact. And we'll see how it goes. We'll see how they react to it. There's some women there even some women who with their hijab. Why she's been invited, I don't know. Anyway.
Do you think Islam can be reformed?
No, I don't think so.
You don't. You
No, I
don't.
think that people, in my last book on atheism and free thought in Islam, it's called Losing the, what is it called? Losing the Allah delusion. Oh no, Leaving the Allah delusion behind. I show that there is an incredible rise in ex-Muslims around the Islamic world, but people, of course, still incredibly frightened of mentioning it in public because of obvious reasons. Danger to the family, fear of social ostracism, and not wishing to upset the parents, family members, and so on. But it's an enormous, it's a huge movement. It's an absolutely huge movement. It's not just a few people here and there. It's now a real tsunami, you express.
Of Muslim
Cliche.
apostates.
Yeah.
How? Where? I don't see that. Where is that happening?
It's online. It's online. A lot of it has to be for various political and social reasons.
Across the world, across the West.
No, across the Islamic world. You'd have to look at my book, and it's called "Leaving the Allah Delusion Behind."
So one would, since October 7th, one would be forgiven for getting quite a different impression because, as we've seen, I'm from London. Almost not every weekend, but many weekends since October 7th, we have mass protests. It's not just Muslim groups, but it's also there's, I guess, leftist white British groups, but there's a lot of Muslim groups. We've already talked about what British Muslims think about October 7th in this conversation. And at the time of speaking, last night was the Eurovision contest in Malmo, Sweden, which is now 1/5, I think, either Muslim or immigrant population. Tens of thousands of protesters outside of the stadium where the Israeli singer was singing. Inside the arena, while she was singing, you can see footage where everyone's booing and hissing her. We're seeing this across Europe. It actually looks like quite a different story, that actually Muslims are very confident. They have a very different worldview to Westerners. And we have an issue of assimilation and integration with these two groups living beside each other. And you live in France. We've seen a lot of that in France. We've seen a lot of the Islamist attacks. So you say, on the one hand, there's a tsunami of apostates, but that doesn't really look like it if you follow the news.
No, because the reason I say people are scared of revealing that.
But it's not just about scared, because they're taking the streets in the name of their faith.
I'd had to put a figure on this. I don't know how many in terms of numbers. I've no idea. But I think you will get a different picture from what you describe if you read my testimonies of people who've left. The number of people who are no longer afraid to speak up. But it's still a minority who speak up. But I think the actual number of who actually are is greater. I have no way of proving all that.
What do you make of what you've seen in Europe since October 7th? What's your impression of the protests?
Yeah, I find it very, very frightening, very disappointing. The politicians haven't been firm enough. They have not stood up against this barbarity. But I'm a little bit isolated where I am.
Given your personal story is one of coming to England and really feeling like an Englishman before feeling rejected by others, so your life is one where you've contested with the issues of integration. It almost felt like you were rejected. You felt rejected at some point. But given there's huge demographic changes in Europe through mass migration, this is a question I think we really need to address. We really need to talk about. Politicians need to talk about it for social cohesion, if nothing else. I wondered if you had insight not only on a personal level, on a societal level, and how we should approach these two worldviews of people living side by side.
I think it won't help if you pretend that the situation isn't what it is. You must speak up, and there should be zero tolerance of imams, religious leaders in the Islamic world in Europe who spout hatred of Jews, of the West generally. Nobody wants to speak up. I give examples in my, I forget, there are all sorts of complacent, especially left-wing, this is a left-wing phenomenon. What my well, I was going to say my friend, I've never actually met him, writer called Michel Onfray. He wrote a book called The Art of Being French, in French. And he has a chapter which I translated and had published on Jihad Watch. It's called Islamo-Gauchism.
Oh, yes.
I don't know whether you saw that, but it's a very much left-wing defense, basically, of Islamic barbarism. The refusal to criticize any aspect of Islam whatsoever. It's just unbelievable what they should read this article, that I've translated. It's quite frightening. These are how they're totally inconsistent. Well, how can you expect a Moroccan Muslim to integrate into a society which is being taught is in corrupt and filth and it's sinking? Who wants to integrate into a sinking ship? The left wingers have been teaching everybody, the whole population, to hate the West, and this has got to stop. This is you've got to put up as defense in the way that I will try and do on Wednesday.
Yeah, so this is what your speech is going to be about.
Yes, defending the West and how what the it's based on exaggeration and complete fabrication of numbers and figures. Like Ward Churchill, who was at the University of Colorado, who actually was thrown out for for fraud. He said something like 32 million. I'd have to look at my notes. I can't remember the figures, but he plucks out of the air. It's all in his book. But so many million Indians and indigenous people were massacred by the Europeans, whereas in fact, for example, there's a website which says that 7 million. This is funded by the U.S. government, 7 million Taino Indians on Hispaniola, the island that Columbus landed on. 7 million were exterminated. The total population of this island was 250,000. How could this is the kind of exaggeration.
In North America, the estimates now it's 10 million were killed of indigenous Americans.
Yeah.
But something like 90% of that, 95% was from disease that went ahead of the people, before the people even... horrendous, obviously, but we don't get the right picture of what actually happened.
In fact, there was a series of articles in The Spectator. Did you read those? In the London version by Finn Paul.
didn't see this.
Jeff, and I rely a lot on his book for. Unfortunately, it's frustrating. He doesn't give the proper references. I wrote to him about it, and he was very blasé about it. But anyway,
So you like your references, you check everything, and
yeah, oh yeah, I have to. I can't rely on.
a real historian.
If somebody says so, I have to check that this is in fact.
If only everyone was like that. That's a good way to be. So you're going to talk about the threat to the West, and part of that is that an undermining of Western history. We talked earlier about slavery. You're mentioning now a rewriting of history that's gone on, and the founding of America and what really happened there. We've talked about Islam, although that's perhaps more of a European issue at the moment rather than it is North American. What are the other threats to the West that you see?
It's the clue to everything. It undermines the confidence of ordinary Americans to hold their head up high. You know, if they've been told that your ancestor did this, and this and that, when it's not in fact true, it's bound to undermine confidence in your own civilization. I think just setting the record straight alone would count for something. But it's amazing how if you have a mindset which is already predisposed to believe in your own iniquity and degradation, then you will accept. You will accept anything that's said. You know, they say yes, yes. You know, please, please beat us a bit more. You know, and it's
that certainly seems like one of the other things. It's a loss of confidence in
civilizational self-confidence.
Civilization,
which is get back, yeah.
Which is very concerning. On a personal level, if you forgive me, and this is, I perhaps pry, but your life seems to be one of tremendous courage. You not only risked physical danger from the wider Muslim community, but you've also explained how it has split up your family a little bit. Where do you think that courage comes from? Why do you care so much about the pursuit of truth? You also describe wanting to check every bit of detail in history, check all these facts. Where does that motivation, where's the drive from?
If you no longer believe in God, I think, and then truth becomes your yardstick. It becomes really important for you to establish what really is the truth. I've sometimes, as I said earlier, I sometimes compromise myself. I back down. I don't speak up when I should have spoken up. I feel I haven't been courageous enough, really. Not unlike Ayan, who's been very courageous on every occasion. I've been quiet when I should have spoken up.
What held you back?
It's complicated. There was a moment when I wanted to be my more technical research to be taken seriously. And for that to happen, I had to make sure that I'm not considered a bigot or an Islamophobe or whatever. So I had to stay neutral so that I can actually make the point about what really happened and so on.
That seems like a good thing then. It's a considered approach because you have a greater objective, which is to be the historian that you want to be and to examine this seriously. It doesn't really seem like anything at all to regret.
I'm a bit muscle bound, and I think I was asked to speak at the Oxford Union about whether Islam was religion of peace or not. This is before I'd actually written this book, The Islam and Islamic Terrorism. It was long before. This is several years ago I was invited. And one of the reasons I turned it down was that I hadn't done all this research. I just hadn't written. I mean, I knew roughly, but I wanted to be really, really watertight. I wanted all my arguments to be soundproof. So I just wish I'd been a bit more courageous at certain times.
You say that once you give up God, truth becomes the new yardstick. I'm sure you must have seen Ayaan Hirsi Ali's recent conversion, her move away from atheism to Christianity. I wonder what you made of that.
Well, I don't know. I can't really question her motives, but I personally also, I mean, Richard Dawkins, in fact, would agree with me on this. Both Richard Dawkins and I think that if you attack Christianity, and people will start converting to Islam.
Well, actually, this is it's more than that, right? So you say when you have no God, truth becomes a new yardstick. We're talking about the West. I would say the new atheists like Dawkins have been incredibly successful in killing God over the last 50 years. And the consequence has been that there's a whole bunch of quasi-pseudo-religions like wokeism, like environmentalism, that have taken the place. And this is something Ayaan quoting Chesterton, if you don't believe in anything, if you don't believe in something, you'll believe in anything. And so you've chosen the truth, but there's plenty of others in the absence of God who aren't choosing truth. They're choosing a new system of life.
It's the same mentality, They accept any nonsense. The lacking in critical thought, the critical thinking. What is your evidence for any opinion that you express, whether it's a literary one or whether it's your preference for a certain opera or some poem? You always ask the question, what is your proof? What is the evidence? Well, you give your reasons for liking certain poetry and certain dramas and certain musical styles and so on. So this is, you give the evidence for your opinion. So you've got to have a critical spirit.
But given how costly the pursuit of truth has been in your life, actually, there's a compelling argument to say that maybe pursuing the truth isn't always smart, and sometimes pursuing what's nice to stick in, to fit in a community, there's value to that as well. And maybe that's...
I would like to be a bit more popular than I am. It's just not going to happen. One of my former girlfriends, her one big desire in life was to be liked by everyone. Unbelievable. Anything to be liked, and is not what I...
Yeah, that can be difficult. Why was that bad for you? Does that mean the truth was...
Yeah, then just... why should you want to be liked by fascists and who...
It's a very good point. Well, that's precisely how those ideologies become so successful. It's because people care more about fitting in and being part of a group, a community, than standing out and risking shame, risking even their lives, if we're talking about the fascists.
Incidentally, one other argument that sometimes people come up with is that you're no longer a Muslim, so you can't criticize Islam. You have to be a fascist to be able to criticize fascism.
Well, that's a fun, positive note to end on. Is there anything else that you'd like to discuss that you feel like we didn't touch on that is important to the audience to hear and to know?
No, I think I've lost my voice.
Well, it's a great pleasure to speak with you. Finally, I think this is was that 2018 that we first met? I think it was. So 6 years ago.
Really?
That I was
6 years
hoping to do
ago.
this,
Wow.
and we've managed to finally do it. Thank you.
Okay.
People who have not read your books, not this one, but and I actually have your other book, Why I'm Not a Muslim. It's in London. I don't have it with me. Where's a place for people to start? Where do you think's the best entry point into your work?
I think Why I'm Not a Muslim is probably followed by probably this one, and then my collection of essays, The Virgins, What Virgins.
Fantastic. Well, on that note, Ibn Warwick, a pleasure, a privilege to speak with you.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you.
I had a very rough childhood in terms of a lot of violence and FGM and control, and I always felt like the weird one in the family, the black sheep.
I was born a Muslim, raised a Muslim, and now I'm an ex-Muslim and an activist for women's rights, especially ones that have left or are still in the religion of Islam.
When I start to wear hijab and looking to my brother, why I wear hijab and my brother not, and then I look to my mom, why she have to get out like this way, and then but I ask myself, I don't want to discuss that with anyone. I only asking myself until I start to wear burqa, full covering. I get this feeling it's not my clothes, but I have to do it for Allah, for my family, for the society.
We were brought up, I always call it this Muslim bubble, because we went to a Muslim school, we were involved in the community, and then we didn't know any other non-Muslims. The only non-Muslims we knew were on TV, so we just weren't mixing with anyone that had a different point of view, although there was slight, obviously, different points of view in terms of within the community. I always felt like my school, my teachers and my friends had a stricter Islam, which I for a very long time thought was the real Islam. Like that music was haram, plucking your eyebrows was haram, all these kind of slightly different things that my parents were a little bit more relaxed on, a more moderate sort of Muslim. But I was very much within a community that were quite strict.
Being a Pakistani woman and being a ex-Muslim, first of all, I will say it's such a dangerous combination. It's not safe for you. If I say I'm from Pakistan, then people think you must be Muslim, because there is a tag which has been always attached to you, to your personality when one is born in a Muslim country or in a Muslim family. I was also raised in a Muslim family, a religious family, but there were always questions in my mind that why there are few things which continuously pinching my mind. And they were just pointing out different things, but I was not supposed to ask questions openly because it was forbidden.
After I turned about 10 or 11, my father joined a Tablighi Jamaat, or part of the Deobandi movement, and he got involved with that, and he enrolled me into an Islamic school. I was really heartbroken about it because I wanted to go to this school that offered horse riding. And that I was really looking forward to going to that school, but then like halfway through summer, my father was like, "We're sending you to an Islamic school," and I was like, "Okay."
My family is Shia. We're Shias, and it's the Jafri Shias. So the community is called the Koja Shia Ithna Ashari Jamaat. So growing up in that community, because everybody knew my dad, they all sort of knew me. They knew whose daughter I was, and it was a big, like, I think it's over 10,000 people in Tanzania that just directly knew my dad. And the community is it's filled with quite a bit of gossips. If one person knows something, there were messages of, when I came out in public, there were messages about me, and they're like, this girl, the daughter of this person, is now an atheist. Let's pray for her to come back to Islam. So from a golden child, I went to like being a black sheep only because despite being the same person, I just disbelieved.
Being a woman, that was also very difficult for me to understand that why the Islam has given so much less rights to a woman, but not a man. So man was granted more and more power, but woman is like, she has nothing actually in Islam. If we study Quran closely and observe the things, what is happening, and also in the society, people treated women such as a little creature. I mean, maybe it's not a nice word to say, but it is the situation in the Muslim countries. So when I got to know, well, I was always being asked by my family if I prayed 5 times a day or not, if I fast or not, if I covered my head or not. I was not supposed to talk to any stranger in the street. I was not supposed to come in front of any cousin. I was not supposed to make new friends, even though no friends. And also my marriage at very early age when I was a school-going girl. So I always heard from my family, once you are married, then you can do it and everything with the permission of your husband. And I was happy, okay, I'm just gonna have at least some freedom. I'm sorry. But yes, it was not the situation. The situation was changed. My husband, he was like more religious than my family. So things were not getting better. They were getting worse day by day. I was forced to do whatever he wanted me to do. So it was the initial stage, and it was the initial step to think about taking some decisions over Islam, over religion. And then I renounced my religion. I renounced Islam.
I remember that I was always a little bit rebellious against certain things. I didn't like praying. Madrasa for me was torture. I remember I used to skip madrasa to go to sing for the president of Kenya school choir, because that was better. The president of Kenya at the time was a dictator. But I remember I used to skip madrasa to go and participate in school choir. I also remember hijab was forced on me when I was about 6 or 7, around the time I had FGM done on me. And I remember sort of just pulling my hijab on door handles and just to tear it apart a little bit, just so that, you know, I didn't like it, so but I couldn't like outrightly drop it. So I was like, make sure it got on the door handle and it got torn. And so there was that streak of rebelliousness. And then there was a period where I felt like I had brought so much shame and so much rebellion to my family that I wanted to go back to believing. And so I became briefly religious, reading the Quran and trying to understand it, but it didn't last very long. It just kind of confirmed for me what I was running away from.
Islam is like part from your life, because we study it like something really important from when we are like really 7 or 8 years. So in this time, I think no one can asking or why I live like this way, why I believe in this God, why it's really difficult to make your mind, it's waking up and start to ask.
I started wearing a headscarf when I was 8 years old. My parents never forced me, but it was expected of me that when I turned 9, I had to wear a headscarf. So I wanted to be a good girl, and I was like, I want to be a good Muslim. I'm going to start wearing the hijab at age 8.
Yeah, so I felt like I was representing Islam when I was speaking to people, especially because I wore the hijab, and I wore it back at this point because I wanted to be like a cool, hip Muslim and show how amazing Islam is and how relaxed Islam is, you know. And you can interpret it a different way. I definitely, by that point, interpreted things, as I said, a little bit more Sufi and a little bit more spiritual, and it's metaphorical. That's how I understood it at that point. So I always felt like I had to kind of be like, yeah, I'm Muslim, but I'm cool. Like, it was constantly me kind of telling people that. And so, yeah, so I really wanted to spread Islam. And what that started basically was a lot of discussions of, you know, I was speaking to many people, just kind of asking questions. Well, what about Aisha? How come, you know, how come your prophet married a little kid? And it was like, oh, okay, let me go away and learn why that happened, and then come back and face that. And then it was kind of, I would come back and say, well, actually, she was 18, and like, you know, it's just wrong. You know, there's lots of kind of counter arguments that I would come back with, and I think, after saying all the counter arguments many, many times, I'd rehearsed them pretty much. They started to kind of, I started to say it to people, and then as I was saying it, realized how stupid it was.
The other thing that was alien to me while I was like this practicing as a child was that I didn't really have a concept of love or what love was. I just thought it was, you know, this thing that kept you in a family. You know, it just, your family loves you and that's it. And I remember writing things like that because I was quite an avid writer. I used to post on writing sites. I used to write a lot of poetry. And I wrote this long monologue about how I don't think love exists. And I think that love is just a condition that people make once they're put together. And I didn't have that concept until I left. And it was, once I felt it, it was such an uncomfortable experience for me because I didn't know what was going on. I didn't know what it was or how to handle it, and all of my friends kind of, because when I felt it, it had visibly changed me, and all of my friends were looking at me like, this is normal. But for me, it wasn't normal at all. And I had never experienced it, and I didn't know that was something that I was missing out on.
When I was in Kenya, I was aware of Council of Ex-Muslims of Britain with Mariam, and I used to follow Mariam's work. And also, you know, I was aware of Ayan Hirsi's work as well. And then when I moved to the Netherlands, I remember searching if there's a similar thing. I saw that there's a humanist alliance here called the Humanitische Verbond. So I contacted them and I attended one meeting. And when I attended this one meeting, one of the ladies was like, oh, by the way, did you know that there's an upcoming conference where Mariam Namazi is going to be speaking? I was like, that's my hero. Introduce me. So, yeah, and I wrote to Mariam, and that's that. And I said, I think I want to come out. I think I'm ready. I'm shit scared, but I think I'm ready. And she said, yeah, do it. And then, yeah, that one thing led to the other, and here we are.
The first thing I started really looking into was the hijab. And that was, I think, the first doubt. Because, as I said, I was really trying hard to be a cool Muslim. So I made friends with, all my friends were actually not Muslim apart from one. And we had like our little kind of crew, and they were like, let's go on holiday together. And I was like, yeah, I'm going to be a cool Muslim. I'm going to go on holiday with them. This is fine. Because Islamically, in the back of my mind, I was thinking, I can't really go without a mahram, but this is fine. I was trying to tell myself, I'll figure it out. And we went to Italy together, and you know, there were so many times where I was feeling like again, the guilt was coming. But there was this one day we were on the beach, and like obviously on the beach in Italy, everyone's kind of in bikinis, sometimes topless. And I was there with my little burkini, kind of fully covered, looking really odd. And then my friends were in their bikinis. So I was kind of like trying to act like I was confident in my burkini, like this is what I'm supposed to do. But as I was sitting there, I was looking around and I was thinking, like, these women that are wearing a lot less than I am are actually getting less attention, but also I understood in that moment that, you know, there isn't this kind of like guys going crazy and like, it's not chaos. It's not kind of like, these men aren't like animals where they're gonna like pounce on you and I really started to think about that. And that moment really stayed with me because I realized, hold on, the hijab is to protect us and to kind of, you know, our modesty is supposed to, you know, all the things I used to say is like, we're like a pearl, we're beautiful, we're too beautiful to be seen. And if men see us, I don't really know what the other side is, but it's just this expectation that men can't handle it, I guess. So that, I understood it as, hold on, in the West, where people are a lot more naked, the men are a lot more respectful. And if I were to go to Morocco, where my mother's from, or Egypt, where my dad's from, you know, these countries that I know, or any other Muslim country, really, even later on I went to Pakistan, you know, even if you just show like a bit of leg, the men go crazy and they stalk you, and it's dangerous. It's actually dangerous for a woman to go out on her own and not be hassled by these men. So the concept of hijab as a function in society to protect women and to create this kind of harmonious way of living between men and women actually wasn't working and didn't work. And that was the first thing that was my doubt, because I was like, how come it's, you know, not having it and having this respect between men and women, regardless of what the hell I'm wearing, you know, there is this respect there. So then I started to think, well, how can a concept such as hijab, that's supposedly from a god, not work?
And I studied Quran closely. I observed each and everything, and I got to know, well, it is a man-made. There is nothing, I mean, our supreme power is saying in Quran, go and kill people. I mean, there are more than 100 verses in the Quran which says go and kill people, kill non-Muslims. Why? A supreme power, how he can do it, how he can say go and just kill others. So these kind of things, they just changed my mind.
I was 26, 25. In this time in Saudi Arabia, you don't have anything to do, only to sitting in your room and doing internet, Twitter, Facebook, and other things. So in this time, I was completely outside this world, I can say. I don't know there is people in our world, they don't believe in God. I don't know there is people in our world, they don't have any religion. And then I was completely shocked. I feel like it's important information, why they hide it, why I don't know it.
I was always taught to hate gay people, like, you know, they don't deserve to be a recipient of any dignity, but I couldn't put myself in a position to hate gay people or Jews only because the book has said so. I'm like, no, they're still people. So it all started with like an empathetic mindset and altruism, that I couldn't put myself in this position that just didn't like a group of people based on their orientation or their religion.
I was really taken aback by the size of the school. It literally was like it was like ground floor, first floor, and there were like 3 classrooms, but really they were like bedrooms. There was 1 toilet, and we had like a little granite outdoor area that we called a playground. And the school was really excited that we had 1 interactive board, like a whiteboard. They like even put it in the letter that they sent us, like my acceptance letter, which I found really interesting. But I went along with it, and I thought, you know, my dad knows best for me. So I went, and I was a daddy's girl as well. So I was going to do anything to make him happy. So I went along with it. There was no uniform except the jilbab and like a headscarf. But one of my teachers, she was an Islamic studies teacher, she used to cover her face, and I thought that that was like really cool as like an 11-year-old kid that couldn't express anything. So I like looked, and I used to ask a lot of questions about it, like, is it uncomfortable, like you know, can you take it off anytime? And she would give me answers. She'd really put up with me, as because she was my Islamic studies teacher through all my phases of being as like a young Muslim. She really put up with me because I would really haze her with questions. And some days she would just get so fed up, she would literally sit me in a corner and say that you need to just be quiet. But I used to see her wearing the niqab, and it like interested me because I knew I couldn't take off my, you know, my headscarf or my jilbab, but I could put on a niqab. It was an option for me. As like, and I had said this on like other podcasts before, where people asked me like, were you ever forced to wear it? And I always said that no, I feel as though I made the choice to wear it, but not for religious reasons. I did it because I thought it was like an identity marker. Like I would have been the only girl in my school to have worn it, and I would have been the only girl in my family to have worn it. And I didn't really have like many other ways of expressing my individuality besides that. But obviously, like when I was an 11-year-old girl, I would have said, oh, I'm doing it for God, whatever. It wasn't until I turned about 14 that I just continued asking a lot of meddling questions. So within the Deobandi circles or within Tablighi circles, Sunnis have like 4 different schools of thought that they adhere to, you know, Hanbali, Shafi'i, Maliki, Hanafi, you know, all of those different schools of thought. And I became aware of a movement that rejected all of these ideas because they were constantly contradicting each other. And my teacher had this idea, so the one, I don't know if I'm over explaining this, but the one concept that my teacher had introduced to me was that when Shafi'is go to Hajj, they actually become Hanafis because they can't do the tawaf without touching a woman. And in the Shafi'i school of thought, if a man touches a non-mahram woman, his purity breaks, and you can't do the tawaf without being pure. And I thought, but they're already Muslims, so why would they need to convert to another school of thought? That doesn't make any sense. So that was like the chink in that armor. And I thought maybe I need to go to a more literalist interpretation. And like when I brought it to my father, it just, you could see the sort of psycho spinning in his head and just being like, there's something wrong here. And he took it to the masjid, and he would constantly have arguments, and then he would just constantly find other contradictions. And he saw all these like contradictions, and he was like, we should definitely move to a more literalist interpretation. And then both myself and my father brought this Salafi hell onto my family, and we more or less radicalized everyone to this new school of way of thinking.
Over societies like Pakistan and Saudi Arabia and other countries as well, the Islamic states, they give such a little space to women. They think the man is a master of a woman. So a woman, she is always obliged to do what her husband, her father, her son, her brother is saying. And if a woman, she does not follow, then she was, in several cases, she was killed in the name of honor. You heard about the honor killing as well. It is really, really normal in Pakistan, in the society of, Pakistan. So I thought to get more freedom, it is also important for a woman to stand up and speak and to tell the world, well, if you are a woman, it's not a crime, it's not a sin.
A lot of the reason why I kind of became very religious was definitely to kind of close up that feeling of guilt, because of the guilt that I mentioned. Definitely it was kind of like, well, the only way for me to get rid of that is to do this properly. I don't want to go to hell,